Good morning, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So I'm going to try and knock out the credible threat theory in 10 minutes or less. The credible threat theory is really the decades-long strategy coming from the Federal Reserve on how it is that they conduct monetary policy, considering that they had lost the ability to adjust interest rates once they had hit the lower bound of zero. Knowing that this was no longer going to be an effective tool for stimulating the economy, they came up with other tools and other ways of stimulating the economy, and mainly it's their words, credible threats, that does it. Now, I'm going to take you back in time to 2002 to a Beranke speech that was given on deflation. This speech is, again, it's dated November 21st, 2002. And in this speech, the entire contents of it is how to deal with a deflationary scenario, because that was their major concern. And mainly, it was when they run into the lower bound of zero. This is what he has to say in this speech. Because central banks conveniently conduct monetary policy by manipulating the short-term nominal interest rates, some observers have concluded that when that key rate stands at or near zero, the central bank has run out of ammunition. That is, it no longer has the power to expand aggregate demand and hence the economic activity. It is true that once the policy rate has been driven down to zero, a central bank no longer uses its traditional means of stimulating aggregate demand and thus will be operating in less familiar territory. So they knew this time was coming, and we experienced this during the great financial crisis, in which that the Fed funds rate had hit the lower bound of zero interest rate policies for a significant amount of time. Now, he continues on to talk about preventing deflation, like do whatever you can to not allow deflation to ever occur. But if it does happen, if you find yourself in that situation, right? And this is what he has to say. But suppose that despite all the precautions, deflation were to take hold in the U.S. economy, and moreover, the Fed's policy instrument, this is the Fed funds rate, were to fall to zero. This is the exact situation that took place just after the great financial crisis, as the Federal Reserve was attempting to stimulate the economy. They took the Fed funds rate to zero. What then? So they knew once they hit zero, stimulating the economy with interest rate adjustments was no longer going to be an effective tool. And they had achieved that lower bound of zero, which meant that they had run out of monetary policy. However, Ben Bernanke had something to say about that. He said, the conclusion that deflation is always reversible under a fiat money system follows from basic economic reasoning. A little parable may prove useful. Today, an ounce of gold sells for $300 more or less. And remember, this was the early 2000s. Now, suppose that a modern alchemist solves his subject's oldest problem by finding a way to produce unlimited amounts of new gold at essentially no cost. Moreover, his invention is widely publicized and scientifically verified, and he announces his intention to begin massive production of gold within days. What would happen to the price of gold? Presumably, the potentially unlimited supply of cheap gold would cause the market price of gold to plummet. Indeed, if the market for gold is to any degree efficient, the price of gold would collapse immediately after the announcement of the invention, before the alchemist had produced and marketed a single ounce of the yellow metal. Do you hear what Ben Bernanke's suggestion for dealing with an economy when the Fed funds rate hits zero is to talk about the possibility of what could come to the future, very much like this guy inventing a gold machine. So if the gold machine has a credible threat behind it and it is well announced out there to the media, everybody would be like, man, this guy's going to produce a bunch of gold, destroying increasing the supply, destroying the demand, and the prices would fall immediately, and the markets would behave as if that had already occurred. And that's the heart of the credible threat theory. Now, if you take this a little bit further, and you go to November, and it's weird, this is again November 21st, again, right? But this time it's in 2018, you will come across a speech called Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. Now, this speech is given by John Williams. Oops, come on now. Oh, my computer's not operating with me, come on. Oh, why aren't you working? Okay, here we go. So we fast forward to 2018, 2018, November 21st, Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. Now, we have to think the Federal Reserve just came off of massive quantitative easing and zero interest rate policies, and it failed to produce the inflationary scenario that they were looking for. We all know that there was inflation and things that we had seen, but ultimately what the Federal Reserve was looking at for inflation was failed to be achieved, even after all this great money printing had taken place. Again, it was an expansion of the balance sheet from $850 billion to $4.5 trillion. This is what John Williams had to say in this speech. Again, this is November 21st, 2018. Today, we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. That is, the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. So this is what John Williams was having to say back in 2018, is that they needed an inflationary scenario because of the low neutral interest rate. Now, this is hard to kind of wrap your head around, but there's an interest rate where the Fed funds rate, where the Federal Reserve, interest rate setting policy is neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. It's neutral. Now, that neutral interest rate had gone very close to zero, and it was essentially not able to get far enough below zero to stimulate the economy without hitting the lower bound of zero. This is what he has to say. When a recession hits, central banks may not be able to reduce interest rates well below their neutral level to stimulate the economy as warranted because of the effective lower bound on nominal interest rates. So right there, he is just admitting that there is no way that they're going to be able to stimulate the economy if they do not have a way of getting far enough below the neutral interest rate and not hit the lower bound of zero. This downward shift in inflation expectation has a second-round effect on real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. When policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates and further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the downturn worse and reducing inflation even more. So even in times when policy is not constrained, the expectation of below-target inflation in the future affects current decisions made, putting additional downward pressure on inflation. In other words, monetary policy is always swimming upstream, fighting a current of too low inflation expectation that interferes with achieving the target inflation rate. So right there, he is basically admitting that if they do not find an inflationary scenario, they are going to fail at their monetary policy. Now, something very interesting comes up in August 27th of 2022, and that is Powell is giving a speech talking about the new monetary policy that the Federal Reserve is now conducting themselves under. And this policy change has to do with the way that they look at the inflation targeting. This is what he has to say. We have also made important changes with regard to the price stability side of our mandate. Our long-run goal continues to be inflation rate of 2%. Our statement emphasizes that our actions to achieve both sides of the dual mandate will be most effective if long-term inflation expectations remain well anchored at 2%. However, if inflation runs below 2% following economic downturns but never moves above 2% even when the economy is strong, then over time inflation will average less than 2%. Households and businesses will come to expect this result, meaning that inflation expectations will tend to move below our inflation goal and pull realized inflation down. To prevent this outcome and adverse dynamics that could ensue, our new statement indicates that we will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Therefore, following periods when inflation has been running below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. In seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, we are thus not tying ourselves to any particular mathematical formula that defines the average. Thus, our approach could be viewed as a flexible form of average inflation targeting. Our decision about appropriate monetary policy will continue to reflect a broad array of considerations and will not be dictated by any formula. See, the Federal Reserve is using credible threats, their words, to guide the markets. Don't look at the interest rate adjustments. Listen to their words, the mainstream media narrative, and how the market is reacting to that, because that is the monetary policy coming from the Federal Reserve. In 10 minutes or less. Uneducated Economist, you let me know.